We're starting here in Revelation chapter 8, verse 5, and we're going to do a little bit of overlap from last week's because that's exactly how John set this up. This is one thing that often confuses people. It causes people problems when they deal with the book of Revelation, is they try and imagine that Revelation is a series of exact statements, prognostications, predictions of the future that are written directly for them. Instead, the book of Revelation is, as we've said, it's supposed to be an experience. This is an experience that John had. It's meant to comfort the seven churches. Remember the seven churches that he has stated at the outset? That is his intended audience. The fact that you and I are able to read this is just lucky for us, but we weren't the intended audience here. So as we've gone through, we've talked a lot about some sevens already. We've got the seven churches of Asia Minor, don't we? What was the last seven that we talked about? Or series of seven? Censors. The censors are... The last one was... What was the last one? No, it was the seven seals. I'm sorry. Yeah. The censors are coming up. I'm like, I know that the censor, well, he has seven censors, but there are the seven bowls of wrath that are going to be coming up a little bit later, and now we are entering the seven trumpets. Now, when the seven trumpets are handed out, we know that the seventh seal has been broken. The seventh seal lists what happens with the seventh seal. There is silence. Silence. Because it has been very loud up to this point, and it will continue to be loud. This is also another thing to remember about the book of Revelation. There are a couple of things that we bring into Revelation. Number one, we think it's about us when it's not about us. We think that Revelation is a very quiet book. It's very loud, actually. There are earthquakes and people singing and myriads of choirs that no one can count. And they're all singing at the top of their lungs. So when there is silence, that is kind of a big deal. We are entering into, I believe this is the first of 3 sets of sevens. So you have the 7 seals. We finished that. So this is the second one, which is the 7 trumpets. And then we'll have the 7 bowls of wrath. Another thing to remember is that when these series of sevens come about, first off, why 7?
Completion.
Perfection, completion. Actually, in Greek, perfection and completion are the same words. It can be pleruo or it can be tetelestai. It means it's been brought to its completion. That's why when Jesus says on the cross, tetelestai, it is finished, it also means it has been brought to its completion. It has been fulfilled. Also, another thing that is worth noting here, though, is this is also supposed to remind us, most of Revelation is supposed to remind us of the book of Genesis. It is either a series of actions of uncreation, which is the destruction of everything that is corrupted. Kind of like when we have a major ice storm and we have fallen down tree limbs. A lot of times it's got to get messier before it gets cleaner. And so that is what happens in the book of Revelation. There's an act of uncreation, just like when those limbs fall, they're already broken, so you got to cut them up into smaller pieces so that they can be moved. Otherwise, you'll throw out your back. So this is kind of a similar thing that's happening here in the book of Revelation. It's also a series of creation. And that's why the number 7 is so important, because of the 7 days of creation or being brought to its completion. You will also notice that when it gets to the end of those series of sevens, there's worship and rest. And it's supposed to remind us of how God rested on the 7th day. So, we will go through that, and that will happen here in this series of 7. What's interesting is that this series of 7 is going to bleed into the next, the last series of 7 bleeds into this series of 7. Okay. So we're here at the 7 trumpets, and roughly these are the burning of the green, the falling fiery mountain, the great star wormwood, and the dimming of the celestial bodies. The first 4 trumpets are kept together. Just like last time, there was a series of 4 and a series of 3. This is actually why 7 is considered a number of perfection. It's considered a number of completion, because 4 is considered to be a complete number, 3 is considered to be a complete number, and so you bring the 2 of them together. Something that is definitely worth mentioning that we overlook, a lot of us try and analyze numbers like the modernists we are, like the Westerners that we are. We imagine that numbers are going to correspond like algorithms or data points, and that if we just look at the numbers as raw numbers, we'll understand it. But in the ancient world, they were much more focused on narratives. This is why histories don't always go in chronological order. In fact, a lot of times when they're compiling biographies, ancient histories, they will organize things less as like what happened or factual reporting chronologically, and more trying to get a common theme to come about. Same thing's true with numbers. Numbers are much more important for what they represent. So the number 7 representing completion, or the number 12 representing a different kind of completion, a completion in the number of prophets, or the 12 tribes. That's why there are 24 elders. All right, so the first 4 trumpets consist of this common theme. It's a continuation of the 7 seals. So the last seal is open, there's silence in heaven, but God's passing out trumpets, which, by the way, I have yet to copyright for a title for a Christian book, and Lord knows those Christian books become, they have people working on titles for them. So anyway, haven't copywritten that, so if you want to go out and write a book, I think that'd be a great title for a book. It's a continuation of the 7 seals. It's the fulfillment of the prayers of the people. So what happens here is, as we come to the end, what God has told them is that, in essence, his wrath against people isn't fulfilled. It isn't complete. It hasn't come to its completion. There's that understanding. If you want to think about it, God has a kind of a container for wrath. And what's happening is people are saying, you know, how long, the people waiting along, how long, and he's looking over and seeing it's not quite to the tippity top of there. Finally, it does get to that point. And this is why we are told at the outset that the angel carries it, dips his hand in there, and out of that is the mixture of incense and which is the prayers of the people. And the prayers of the people in Old Testament literature are often considered to be the incense by which God derives a lot of power and majesty, and these are the top forms of praise and prayer, because to go before God with our needs demonstrates that we look to him above all else. So the prayers of the people have been for what up to this point? What are we told the people are praying for here in Revelation chapter 8? The people have been praying for justice. People are praying for justice to come down. A lot of us would like to imagine that you can kind of square the circle. It would be as if you were to go before a judge and claim, this person has wronged me, this person has hurt me in some way, shape, or form, and the judge were to say, well, that's okay, why don't you just shake hands and make up? It doesn't work like that. There has to be some form of justice. Now, for the Christian, justice, we would never be able to bear God's justice fully. But fortunately, Christ has taken that justice upon him. And so God has taken that justice. So what's happening here is the cries for justice are finally being heard, and they will lead into this series of the first 4 trumpets. This fits into the 4-3 motif that we're talking about. And most likely this is supposed to remind us of the parallels to Exodus, as well as creation. Now the previous ones, the previous set of 7 we dealt with were dealing with human plagues and human action. This one will deal more with natural plagues. Or the last one was dealing with natural plagues. This one deals more with human action. I got that reversed. All right. Trumpets meant things in the ancient world. Now, obviously, if any of us heard trumpets blowing now from the sky, we too would be worried. But we do have some references in the ancient world about when, in mythology, for instance, Roman mythology, if trumpets were coming from the sky, the Romans knew that something terrible was afoot. It could be a bad terrible, it could be a good terrible, but something terrible was afoot. It was an omen. And no one in the ancient world was probably as superstitious as those Romans. The Romans had all sorts of superstitions, all sorts of things they worried about and believed. I mentioned on Tuesday, one of my favorite stories from Roman times was they actually had a flock of sacred chickens. And we laugh, but they had a flock of sacred chickens, and the thing was, if they would eat, the sacred chickens, if the sacred chickens would eat, it was set for them, they knew it was okay to go into battle. But if the chickens said, we're not hungry, and kind of milled around and didn't eat, then they thought, well, that's an omen that we shouldn't go to battle right now. And there's a famous story of them being brought on a ship one time right before they're going to have a naval battle. And the chickens refuse to eat. And so the commander of the ship just throws them overboard, saying, well, if they don't want to eat, maybe they're thirsty. Anyway, the Romans, though, and that's not all we have. I mean, they would consult everything imaginable. And so if trumpets are coming from the sky, that's a pretty big omen they can't ignore. In the Jewish culture, it would mean the day of the Lord, this wonderful time when God's presence would finally be felt in the world. And it's obvious that John is bringing both of these things together, especially because the Christians believe that would be the announcement when Christ would return. So here we are with the first trumpet, and this first trumpet is an attack upon the cultivated land. It moves in threes of hail, fire, and blood, and also earth and grass and trees. So this first 3 are what kind of attack, and the last 3 are what are consumed. And it's very interesting, I think, because the blood and the earth are outliers in this particular announcement. They don't seem to fit with the other 2. There's a reason for this. Remember that we've been dealing with the blood of the martyrs in the previous section. And so this is what is being poured out. The blood of the martyrs is a kind of a prayer that judgment must fall upon the earth. And of course, this is the earth and then the green things which grow upon it. It's reminiscent of the 7th Egyptian plague found in Exodus chapter 9. It's pretty self-explanatory, pretty straightforward, that one. The second trumpet. So a great mountain is set on fire in this one. Now, in the ancient world, and especially we see this we see this all over the ancient world. The Greek gods, they all live up in a mountain. Mountaintops were places where people would go. The same thing happened in Japan with Mount Fuji. It was supposed to be the dwelling of spirits. And it's definitely something that we see in the Hebrew literature as well. One would be reminded of another incident. One would be reminded of people going up to Mount Sinai. And we read in the Old Testament in Torah that they go up to the mountain, and it has all of the lightning and fire. And what do the people say when they see all of that? They say, we don't want any part of that. In fact, Moses is begging them to come up the mountain to be in the presence of God, and they say, no, we're too terrified to go up there. And he actually goes up there, and God's angry with them because they're afraid of this display of power. This mountain is on fire. And so it's really at that point where God is considering just throwing in the towel with these recalcitrant people because they're so afraid to come into his presence. But it is a mighty and terrifying thing. Now, if God's people are terrified of a mountain consumed with fire, we can imagine that John is saying that the whole world would be consumed if there was a mountain and it was consumed with fire and it was thrown into the sea. Yes, I know we're all kind of thinking about if you have faith like a mustard seed, you can tell this mountain go into the sea and it'll be tossed into the sea. That can run into our minds too. But really, this vision of this mountain being set on fire and going into the sea, and then what happens when it's tossed into the sea? There is blood. The oceans turn red, which of course would remind us again of the Exodus plague of the Nile, and the Nile turning red. Yeah, it reminds us of the Nile turning to blood, Exodus chapter 7. And this is a typical Hebraism of if this, how much more this. So if the Nile turned red with blood here, imagine how bad it will be when all of the oceans of the world turn red with this mountain being cast into there. And we're told that 1/3 perish. Now, in the first trumpet, 1/3 of the earth is destroyed. The greenery of the earth is destroyed. In this one, 1/3 of the oceans are destroyed. The third trumpet. Now, this is interesting. Wormwood, or Artemisia abyssinium, which is where absinthe comes from. Absinthe comes from wormwood, and it's a liquor made from it's made from, I've never had it. It's made from wormwood. And in the ancient world, it was known for being a very bitter herb. In fact, in the ancient, in the Bible, we're told, this is from the Augsburg commentary on Revelation, it represents sorrow, bitterness, and perverted justice in these passages here. So, it's this notion that all of the sorrow and the bitterness is to be condensed in this flaming star that is going to hit the springs of the world. Also, in the Old Testament, we are told here in Jeremiah, that the prophets are threatened with being fed this bitterness because they fail to stand up against injustice that they see. So again, we're seeing how John's imagination, the stories he's been told, are coming back once again, aren't they? They're coming back in his declaration. What he's saying is God is finally making good on the promise that he stated to Jeremiah back here, where he is feeding the world now the bitterness that he promised to give those prophets. Now, just like if you heard trumpets playing in the sky, just as if you saw a mountain go hurling into the sea, a falling heavenly body was quite a bad portent. And we know that whenever comets passed by, until we really started understanding astronomy as a mathematical structure, the comets were considered to be bad omens, bad portents. And a lot of times you'll read in historical records, and this goes even into the time of the Enlightenment, that you'll read about some sort of bad, whenever something bad happens in history, people claim to have seen a comet flash across the sky. In Exodus 15:25, we're also told another thing here. We're told in Exodus 15:25 a story about how Moses comes to a spring, and this spring is bitter. This is a bitter spring. The people can't drink it. But he strikes it, and he makes the water sweet and able to be drunk. This is the reverse of that. God is taking all the sweet springs that come up from the earth, that are provided from the earth, and he's turning them bitter. This is also a statement about God's power over the natural world. In a lot of these, as we go through and we think about Exodus, the main theme about Exodus was whose God was more powerful. Whose God could make the other God do things. Here, God is challenging this worship of the world in and of itself, by itself. And he is saying that he is powerful enough to be able to exact things from it, to make the world do what he wants it to do. And so here, people who have relied upon the world thinking that was all there was, that was all they needed, now they are finding out that there is a power that's strong enough that can coerce the world to finally fall down. A lot of people also think the book of Revelation is ultimately about God destroying the world like some sort of bad wizard. Instead, what we're told in the Bible is the fact that God has kept the forces of destruction at bay. He's held them off. And we'll get into that a little bit more as we go forward. But we've already talked about what God is doing here is he's removing that kind of prevenient grace from the world. And he's allowing the destruction which we've brought upon it by falling outside of his plan for the universe. He's allowing that destruction to finally come to its fruition. So the bitterness the world gives flows from these springs. Okay. The fourth trumpet. This is the dimming of the heavenly bodies. It parallels the plague of darkness. And the dimming of the light shows a dimming of faith. Now, again, we have talked about in the first plague, 1/3 of the greenery of the earth is consumed. We've talked about 1/3 of the oceans are destroyed. We've talked about, the third plague is 1/3 of the springs, and now 1/3 of the heavenly bodies are dimmed, or the heavenly bodies are dimmed by 1/3. That's all pretty self-explanatory. So let's just move on to the lament of the eagle. And the eagle says, "Whoa, whoa, whoa," 3 times, which three woes is not good. An eagle saying three woes is not good. But we have to ask ourselves, why an eagle? Why is an eagle brought up? Well, the Romans believed that eagles were messengers from God. Now, it's very important for us to bear in mind just what John's doing here. We say, well, now wait a minute, John. Aren't you only supposed to be talking from the Hebrew Bible? John is talking to an audience like we would. And I brought up this illustration. It's like if a pastor, when a pastor gets up and mentions a movie or a song that's popular right then. Now, are the movies and the songs things that we find in the Bible? No, of course not. You're not gonna see those or hear those things in the Bible. But they are things that are found in the common culture. And so John knows that the common culture that he's in, an eagle is a major portent of things that are about to happen. And so this eagle comes and says, whoa, whoa, whoa. Now, one example of this, before I get ahead of myself. So during the founding of Rome, for instance, one of the portents was that they saw an eagle fly over the place where Rome was to be founded. So that's where they knew where Rome should be founded. So these eagles are something that are known in Roman culture. Again, when they would go into battle, on their standards, when they would march into battle. The standards, by the way, that you were not allowed to, you could not give up the flag. Someone had to hold the standard at all times. Mm-hmm. Those standards, on the top of them would be an eagle. It was supposed to represent Rome. And so this eagle declaring that there is going to be a woe seems to imply that there is going to be destruction against Rome. Now, this will escalate as we get further on in the story that Revelation tells us. But this is just as God is taking down the false idols that we construct and we look for all of our safety and security. He's also going to war against the earthly power, and the earthly power is going to be represented by Rome. Now, the three woes correspond to the next three plagues that we'll be dealing with. And this brings us to the last three trumpets. The loosing of Abaddon and his riders, and the riders that come from the Euphrates, and the opening of the heavenly temple. Now, we have the last three trumpets. These are judgments from the powers of destruction. And they show that God has power over the empires of the world. This is brought about, again, by the calls of the martyrs, the calls for justice. These people have been undone, destroyed by the earthly powers. Whether those earthly powers are the big one that we think of as being Rome, or maybe just their local governments. Their local, not even their local governments, but they really didn't have local governments like we have local governments, so it's a bit of a misnomer there. But their local groups. We were talking earlier about how we would all kind of like to go off the grid when the power goes down, and to have stuff to be able to be more self-reliant. Self-reliance was not something a human being could do until very, very recently. To be ostracized, to be removed, to be exiled from your community was a fate equal to death in the ancient world, because when you are outside of a community, there's no guarantee that you will survive. We talked a little bit about this earlier. I told the story about a person who was lost in the Australian outback during the colonial period there, and his journal entries include all of these stories about how he's just a hair's breadth away from dying of hunger until he's adopted by an Aboriginal community down there. And then we never see him talk about being a hair's breadth away from hunger again. The problems that come about from being alone are no longer there. Community didn't just provide, oh, it's nice to be around people, or it's nice to hang out. Community was a matter of life and death. And the only thing worse than being removed from your community would be to have your community come up against you. So the local communities, as well as the larger Roman Empire, were against them, and God's justice is now going to be enacted because all of these people have done something radical, something very different from anything in human history, which is that they have declared that they are going to believe in something other than what their community is saying. This is the way things have to be. They're going to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. All right. So here we are at the fifth trumpet. Abaddon, the destroyer. This is one of those confusing things, and I'll admit that I am a little bit perplexed about this character of Abaddon. Now, there is an angel, we're told, and he is sent down from God in order, with the keys to the abyss, in order to release Abaddon. Now, in the Hebrew world, there wasn't just one underworld. There were multiple levels of underworld. There was Sheol, which was the place where the dead awaited to be resurrected. And there was, of course, the area that you could kind of see. This notion of the underworld would also be something familiar with the Greco-Roman world. And in the Greco-Roman world, there was a character by the name of Hades who ruled over, quite interestingly, a place called Hades. And he had control not just of this underworld, which was divided into multiple levels in the afterlife. He also had control over precious gems. And that's a fun story if you ever want to get to know it. But Hades was also someone that no one would mention. If you were a Greek, you would never talk about Hades. And so they know this. This is something that John would know. In addition to that, though, when we see the Abaddon in the Old Testament is never a person. It's always a place. It's always this place of destruction. And so what he is saying is this is the personification of the ruler of that place of destruction. Much in the same way that Hades would be the ruler of Hades. Abaddon's the ruler of Abaddon. And so he is this powerful creature who has the power to undo. Again, when we see the Greek, it says Apolloion. We'll kind of get back to Apollyon in just a few seconds. But Apollyon means to destroy. It comes from the Greek word apolluo, which is the word for destroy, but it's a compound word. And it means to kind of undo from the foundations. And I always like to think of it, it's like in the Greek understanding of destruction, it's almost like an unraveling of a sweater. And so this is what is happening here. Now, I don't know if Abaddon is necessarily evil per se. He's gotten a rap for being evil, but he has one job to do, which is to destroy, and he's being released to destroy now. And so you'll have a very heated discussion about whether or not this angel that's coming down is Satan falling, or if this angel coming down is a messenger from God to release Abaddon. My feeling is the angel is a good guy. The angel's doing the Lord's work. Satan is not going to, after leading a rebellion, is not going to say, well, you know, I guess I can do you a favor and release Abaddon. No, God is sending this messenger down to release Abaddon. Whether or not Abaddon is a good guy or bad guy, I don't know, but I think C.S. Lewis offers an interesting perspective when he talks about the White Witch in the Chronicles of Narnia, where he states that this person was God, or was their God's hangman, but got a little bit too full of himself. Maybe that's what Abaddon's story is. We don't really know. We do know he has one mission, and that is to send out these monsters to come and destroy. Now these locusts, they emerge from this pit to inflict pain. Not to kill, but to inflict pain. For how long?
5 months.
5 months. This number 5 is something that reappears over and over and over again as this in this kind of theme here. So they're called forth to inflict pain. Now the interesting thing about these locusts is, what does a locust do?
Eat everything.
Eats everything. Boy, that's actually one of the best definitions of a locust I've heard. Yes, it's something that eats everything. And what are these locusts told not to do?
Don't eat anything.
Exactly. They're not even supposed to eat their victims. They're just supposed to cause pain.
Torture.
Exactly.
Right.
And it's interesting. So you have these critters basically who have one identity, to eat everything, but who are being told to go against their very nature, or been created to do something completely different. Now, of course, when he's talking about these locusts, we are supposed to think about the Exodus story and the plague of locusts, aren't we? Now, these locusts, though, I heard one very interesting perspective, which are these locusts are the representation of idols. And that what is happening here is that the idols are finally being released, and people are seeing the idols as they really are. Now, Lutherans, and if you read through Martin Luther's works, Luther had a very interesting perspective that there's really only one commandment. The other 9 are kind of telling you, like filling in gaps about the first commandment, which is, you shall have no other God before you. So you don't have any other gods before you. An idol, Luther says, is that to whom we run to I can't get it exactly right, run to in all distress, and look to for all needs, all good things. And really, I think that's a really good definition of idolatry. Whenever we sin, we have this notion that sin and the performing of sin is somehow or other us being kind of like Snidely Whiplash. We finally get to do some evil. We finally get to perform a bad thing. Sin never feels like sin while you're doing it. Sin, what happens, the first stage of sin is we first have to lie to ourselves. We've got to convince ourselves that what we're doing is A, not really bad, or B, beneficial to us. In that case, sin is an idol. It's something we're looking to get us out of a scrape or to make our lives just a little bit better. And the thing about that is, you start making deals with these idols. Pretty soon, you're finding out that you're doing everything, you're performing everything, and so your obligations, you're following these idols. Why? Because you think you'll get something from it. Why do we pursue money to such an obscene way? Why do we cut corners when we're making money? Why do we cheat people out of their money? It's because we've convinced ourselves that what we're doing isn't really that bad after all. Because everyone's doing it, or because that's just the way the world works, or because I'm probably a good person somewhere else. But here I'm gonna do a little something that's not quite above board. We do the same thing with fame. When we pursue our reputation, why do we cut someone down so that we can kind of climb up on top of them? You know, why is it that we ignore family or people who pursue fame just with a single-minded focus, remove themselves from family and friends? And it's all because they believe that fame will give them everything they're after. That's what idolatry really is. It's this belief that these things are contractual gods. And if we just give enough of ourselves, we'll get what our hearts desire. It's very interesting to contrast that with this story that we find in the gospel, which is that God promises to put a new heart in us so that we finally desire Him and desire Him alone. And then we don't have to worry about pursuing all of these other idols. Now, here, what this scholar says, and I think he's right, is that these locusts are coming out, and they are the very representation of it, because what does idolatry do? It eats you away. It causes you nothing but pain. And so here they are meant to bring them pain. The sixth trumpet. Now this one is broken up into multiple parts here. Sixth trumpet, we see a destructive cavalry come from the Euphrates. An angel gives John a book to eat, and the temple is built, and the martyrs are raised. All this time, we've noticed something interesting. We've noticed in the first 4 sections that only 1/3 have been destroyed. This is not a total destruction. We've also noticed in the last section that even though the destroyer is released from his realm of destruction, and we expect locusts who are built for destruction to be destroying, instead they're supposed to torment. Why? Why is that? Why are we not seeing destruction here?
You're not ready to show it. That's why I had to meet the scroll.
He's not ready to show it. He will show it in the next series of 7s. But here, this is meant to call people to repentance. There's this wonderful fact that we see throughout Revelation of this call to repentance contrasted with the glory of God. And it's this part where John is saying, why wouldn't you take God up on His offer? So here we are now. We're about ready to enter into this new series here in the last 3 trumpets. The destructive cavalry. Now these critters, we've got another set of critters.
Yeah, they were colors too.
And they are coming from the east. They come from the Euphrates. Why is that?
That's the seed of Babylon.
Okay.
And the Magi. Don't forget they did that too.
They do. They come from the east. Now, in Western culture, evil always comes from the east. Look at what the Greeks. We talked about this last time when Octavian, who would become Augustus, fought against Cleopatra and Mark Antony. His claim was that Mark Antony had become Eastern-minded. When people criticized Alexander the Great all those centuries before, they criticized him for going in and behaving as an Eastern potentate. The Romans were constantly fighting against the East. That continues on until throughout Christendom, as the armies of Christendom fight against invaders from the East. But it doesn't end there, does it? We still got this. I mean, and especially this is very problematic when we deal with countries that are from or rooted on England, which is the most Western you can get, one of the most Western countries you can get. Because the English would do the same thing when new colonists would arrive from Central Europe and then Eastern Europe. Oh, you can't have that.
Well, the Normans came from the East too.
What?
The Normans. They came from France.
The Normans, yeah. Well, anyway, we get lost in the high weeds there.
Let me ask you this: does that have anything to do with the flow of rivers going from west to east?
No, it has to do with the fact that Europe's a peninsula, and they weren't going to get invaded from the west. So invasion was always going to come from the east. And so it always created this us versus them mentality within Western mindset. I mean, this is seen in imperialism. You know, we can't just we can't allow ourselves to be. It's us versus them. Either we're going to get conquered by the East, or we're going to conquer the East. You know, what do we see? You know, what do we call the Germans during World War I? We refer to them as the Huns, those Eastern invaders who came and took over Rome. The story of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, right there in that DNA is a fear of invaders coming from the East. Indeed, they are called Easterlings there. So there is this tremendous fear of the East, and it starts from pretty much the dawn of Western civilization, which is how we define ourselves.
Well, the barbarians came from the East, the Mongols came from the East, everybody came from the East.
Yeah, well, they weren't going to come from the West. So, but the fact of the matter was, it moved beyond just the physical reality of them coming from the East to a psychological fear and phobia of the East itself, because that's the place where invaders come from. And
that's kind of interesting, though, that corresponds with the river flows going from west to east, and it's always the east side that's the cheap side, or the, you know.
Well, I mean, it depends on where you're from, because
that was the next question. That's the way it is, you know, like in modern civilization.
Yeah, cities.
Because the rich people were on the west, and the rivers would flow to the east, and all their sewage and everything else would flow that direction.
It goes downhill.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So it's east side is.
But I mean, you know.
And the one time the Mongols tried to go west.
Yeah, but we're on the east side of Georgetown.
Well, I'm sorry I missed that. No, but I mean, if you think about it, though, it's not always the case that yes, a lot. When we were on the eastern coast, the eastern seaboard, that's how it went. But then you move west of the Mississippi, and things move a little bit backwards that way. And it's also something that's kind of caught up in just sort of the geography and the way people are primed to think of things. Yeah, your poorer sections of towns are always going to be on the south side, or going to usually be, if they're in the north, they're going to be on the south, and usually on the eastern side. But that's not always the case. I mean, if you're west of the Mississippi, it may be the western side that's the poorer side because of the way that those rivers flow. So I don't know if that's quite analogous there. But east, so they're coming from the east, and the Romans had this terrible fear of the east, and we could, as believe it or not, as much as we've talked about that right now, we could go on for a much longer time just talking about the fear of the east. So what John is tapping into is this phobia that the Romans have. And he is saying, you think you're so powerful. Our Lord has, from the place of conquest, he has a group of riders who could come and kick your butts, and they are larger, much larger, than anything the Roman army could field. I think I read it was like 20 times what the Romans could field at their apex. That was how many John was claiming were waiting under the Euphrates to come there. At this time, Rome is facing off against the Parthian Empire. Rome also, when it absorbed Greece, absorbed all of Greece's hopes and fears and ways of looking at the world. So the Greeks were terrified because they had been invaded by the Persians. The Romans wanted nothing to do with the Persians. They were afraid the Parthians had kind of taken over from them. So the Euphrates is considered the ultimate borderland. Rome claimed to have its borders go up to the Euphrates, but it really couldn't claim to go any further than that.
Would that be like Turkey and the division between Turkey and Europe?
Well, the Euphrates is over in Iraq. But yeah, I mean, the history of Turkey and Europe is far more complex and interesting. Mm-hmm. But you're right, in a very broad outline, it is the debate between the Greek mainland and the Greek islands and Turkey. And even though there were Greek cities in Turkey and Greek cities that allied with the Persians during the invasion, in a very broad outline, Turkey is definitely considered an other place.
Were the Persians the east side?
They were on the east side.
Okay.
They were on the east side. They didn't. I don't know if they had gang symbols, but they were on the east side. Let me pause right here. Pause to scratch my nose.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
All right, so as we said, the cavalry is coming from the east. This is meant to instill fear. A good deal of the Bible is meant to instill fear in Rome. You brought up earlier the story of the Magi coming from the east. The Magi were pretty much this group of this entourage that surrounded the Persian nobility, and they would declare who was the next person to be made the ruler over Persia. And so when they looked up the sky and they saw this heavenly body, Matthew's recording of them coming here is meant to challenge Rome's authority by saying these Persian kingmakers have come in here, and now they are declaring that this person is supposed to be the king. So there are a lot of these challenges being laid down Rome. Why? Because Rome has this authority. Rome is persecuting Christians. And because Rome is persecuting Christians, or allowing Christians to be persecuted in the best of times, what John is trying to say is there is a higher authority that is waiting until justice has been fulfilled, until the prayers of the martyrs has finally been topped off, and then God's wrath will come down on people, God's judgment. Now, we've said this, the population of cavalry is greater than anything the Romans could muster, far greater. Okay, so next we are told that John is supposed to eat this book, which is, of course, supposed to remind us of Ezekiel chapter 3, where God instructs Ezekiel to do what? Eat the book. So this is something that gets lost so much when I can't believe, I just want to shake people when they say, did you read the latest newspaper? I read the nuppaper and I know that Revelation was talking about this. I said, when was the last time you read the Old Testament prophets? Well, I haven't. Because it's far more congruous to the Old Testament prophets. What he's doing is using Old Testament allusions and prophecies in order to explain how God ultimately has control over the cosmos. That no matter how bad things look, no matter what might happen, God has already made sure that he is going to protect his people. So he is told to eat this, and rather than go out and proclaim, there are 7 thunders, and they make a big noise. And these 7 thunders, he's about ready to write it down. Now, of course, when we think of the 7 thunders, we think of Jesus' baptism, and how when that happens, there's a voice from heaven. And some people say it's not a voice, it was just thunder. And so these 7 thunders are saying, so if it's just, in the Gospels, if it's 1 pronouncing Jesus, these 7s are showing how it's this completion, because 7 is the number of completion. So the 7 thunders are showing that there is a completion that's happening. And John's going to write down what they say, and the voice says, stop, don't write that down, which should, of course, remind us of what Jesus has said, that no one knows, not even the Son knows, only the Father knows. So, this is what's happening here. And when he eats this scroll, this book, he says it's sweet and bitter. Now, my interpretation of this is that this is like the gospel. The gospel is, as he says, sweet on the mouth. Well, he doesn't say this about the gospel, but the gospel is sweet on our mouths. We love proclaiming, but it is bitter. The gospel is going to make your life uncomfortable. The gospel is difficult to digest. It's difficult to digest in 2 different ways. Number 1, it's difficult to digest because it puts you at loggerheads with the world, doesn't it? Because the world operates with a completely different viewpoint. If you don't believe that, read Revelation. Because Revelation is saying the world has its own priorities, its own focuses. So, that's one thing. But here's the other thing. It's also at odds with ourselves, with our human hearts. We want to be number 1. And if we can't be number 1, we want to pretend that we earned a place at the table. The thing that drives us most nuts about God is the fact that he gives us everything for free. We don't like that. We like to think that we earned something. There's some reason why I was chosen. There was a reason why you were chosen. It was because Christ died for you. But that is why the gospel is so bitter. It attacks what Luther talks about, we have to watch out for the devil, the world, and our sinful selves. Well, that's 2 out of 3 right there. So this is the way in which this is bitter, or at least what I would say. So whenever you proclaim the gospel, it is sweet on the lips, but it is bitter in the tummy. He's told he can't tell everything, but he is told to build a new city. Let's go ahead and look at that new city he's told to build. Oops.
On the 2 witnesses, you talk about building the temple with 2 witnesses where you measure the temple?
Oh yeah, the 2 witnesses, yeah. This is nice. I love being part of a faith where I don't have to be perfect.
You're pretty close.
I know someone who is perfect, so I don't have to worry. So here we are in chapter 11. Yeah, let's talk about those witnesses first, before we talk about anything else. Um, there are a lot of questions about who those witnesses are, aren't there?
Mm-hmm.
So the sixth trumpet, the two witnesses, this is more of a parable. See, I'm trying to get ahead of in over my skis here. I don't know. I don't know, maybe we could go to the book of Zechariah. Well, let's just go to chapter 4, just for the heck of it.
Chapter 4. Back to
Just go ahead. Who's on Zechariah chapter 4? Not Zephaniah, Zechariah. I'll go ahead and read it. I'm here, I'm at the end. The angel who was speaking with me then returned and roused me as one awakened out of sleep. He asked me, "What do you see?" I replied, "I see a gold lampstand with a bowl at the top. The lampstand also had 7 lamps at the top, with 7 spouts for each of the lamps." All right. And there also were 2 olive trees beside it, one on the right of the bowl and the other on the left. Then I asked the angel who was speaking, "What are these, my Lord?" "Don't you know what they are?" replied the angel who was speaking with me. I said, "No, my Lord." He said, "This is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel. Not by strength or by might, but by my spirit, says the Lord of the armies. What are you, great mountain? Before Zerubbabel, you will become a plain. And he will bring out the capstone, accompanied by shouts of grace, grace to it. Okay, so that is just as confusing, isn't it? Almost. Number 1, we see where John is getting the illustration of what?
Lampstands.
The lampstands and
Bowls.
the olive trees. The 2 olive trees. He mentions 2 olive trees and he mentions 2 lampstands. Now, in the ancient world, olive oil was this multi-purpose wonder drug, if you will. It was, everything ran on olive oil. Everything in the Mediterranean ran on olive oil. You need to cook with something, get olive oil. You need to bathe, get some olive oil. You need to light your lamp, get some olive oil. So olive oil was used in everything. And olive oil would have been used for lighting these lamps, which is probably why the 2 olive trees are mentioned with those. Now, the reason I took us over there was to say, a lot of people are saying, okay, who are these 2 witnesses? They're trying to narrow it down. But the reason that he's mentioning 2, I think, is twofold. Number 1, he is tying it back here to Zechariah. John loves the book of Zechariah. John loves the book of Zechariah. If you want to understand Revelation better, read the book of Zechariah. So he's obviously tying it back there with the angel in front of God and the angel there telling him about these things. This is just before what? A conquest. In Zechariah, a conquest or a prediction of conquest by the Lord of an earthly king. So again, we have this Hebraism. If this, how much more this? If an earthly king can accomplish this, how much more will the Lord accomplish? These 2 witnesses, a lot of people have speculated, oh, well, they represent the law and the prophets. Some people say they represent the 2 people that didn't die, because here they are killed. So their deaths are kind of bringing, finally everyone's died is pretty much what they're saying. So this would be Elijah and Enoch. I couldn't remember who the other person was. Elijah and Enoch are the only 2 people that we have in Hebraic literature who don't die, who are carried up to be with the Lord. So they, there's that theory. Some people have said, as I said, Moses and Elijah, because they represent the law and the prophets. Some people speculate that it's a couple of the apostles, so it could be Peter and Paul, or Peter and John, or whoever, Peter and James, but I think it's a little bit more prosaic than that. I think all it's supposed to represent is when Jesus sent the disciples out first, he sent them out 2 by 2. It's a hobby horse I have. I really think we in America do a lot of things just one person does them. You know, and if I can have a sidebar, I mean, we're already way over time, but if I can have a sidebar here, I would say, I think a lot of the pastors who have fallen from grace would probably have done a lot better in their ministries if there was another co-pastor to keep them accountable. Jesus didn't want people to go out one by one, and I think John sees that. So these 2 who are martyred are supposed to represent the entire church and the way the church is supposed to do ministry. And indeed, it's not just Jesus who did that. The Holy Spirit sent people out. How does the Holy Spirit send people out in the book of Acts? He sends them out in 2s usually. So, these are the 2 witnesses. And they perform their task, and they are killed, and they are mocked, but they are raised to life once again. And this is the story of the gospel. This is the story of how the gospel is preached. And John is trying to say, be like these 2 martyrs. Go and you will be persecuted, but in the end you will be raised up in the last day. All right. I think we are out of time, but again, let's just say that the 7th seal then happens, and as is usual with the 7th seal, it is the singing of praises and glory, and I really wish we could spend some more time on it, but we are way over time, so let's just end in prayer. Lord, we give you thanks for bringing us here together, and we just ask that you go ahead and you carry us forward to proclaim your good news to the world. Amen.